Today I'd like to review with you a little about what the English contributed to American government. Last time we were in class, we did discuss the English concept of ordered government and limited government. We looked at the Mayflower Compact, and we also looked at some of the English documents. But I wanted to start with this as a quick review and lead on to the 5 steps on the road to revolution. If you have your PowerPoint, I would like for you to get that out, and I'm quickly going to go through, trying to limit this to 10 minutes, just some basic information contributing and leading up to the writing of the Declaration of Independence. Remember, England does not have an official constitution, so what they do have is a collection of documents that have contributed over time to our American system of government. For example, the Magna Carta in 1215 was led by King John, and it was an agreement between him and the barons. On my website in Google Classroom, I would like for you to watch the video by Chief Justice John Roberts on the contributing factors of the Magna Carta and look for the significance of that document and why it is so important to American government. Things such as trial by jury, the right of due process of law, that everybody is treated equally under the law, and the power of the leader is not absolute, meaning, in other words, we have limited government. 400 years later, we had the Petition of Right, another English document. In this example, King Charles I had a lot of power and had forgotten many of the principles initiated in the Magna Carta. He, in an agreement called the Petition of Right, signed over many of the king's powers, so it limited the king's authority once again. They reiterated the right that the king does not have absolute power, that there should be a trial by jury of peers, that troops should not be quartered in people's home, and that no martial law in times of peace should take place. The next document I'd like to look at is the English Bill of Rights in 1689. Again, signed by 2 leaders that came over after the Revolution in England when they ousted the kings, and Oliver Cromwell was leading. They brought over William of Mary and Orange. No standing army during peacetime. They wanted free and fair elections. The Parliament had the right to approve any money being spent. Subjects may petition or address the king, a right to a fair trial, and that punishment should fit the crime, and that there should be no excessive bail or cruel and unusual punishment. These are 3 of the documents that we borrowed heavily from when they were writing the Constitution. So as we look at this next phase, we're going to focus a little bit on the history. These are called constitutional underpinnings. In other words, what is the road to revolution? Why did we want to rebel from the most powerful country in the world? So the objectives: how did the relationship between the colonies and Great Britain change before the American Revolution? How did the words of Thomas Paine's document Common Sense impact the revolutionary movement? For what reasons is the Declaration of Independence considered a revolutionary document? And as we look through these, this slide has a list of key terms that we will be addressing. Now, this looks a little overwhelming, but it's hinged or chunked by these terms that are listed in red. Event number 1, New England Confederation, then Albany Plan, then the Stamp Act, First and Second Continental Congress. If you can remember those 5 big steps on the road to revolution, it helps understand and sort of give a chronological timeline of what is so important. So let's go on to the next one. Growing colonial unity. I like to look at this first one. The very first time the colonies, remember, all created independently, the first one starting in 1620, the New England Confederation. Confederation is a loose alliance of independent states. It's a league of friendship. Several colonies said, we need to get together and talk about how we will defend ourselves against the threat of the Native American tribes. The Confederation lasted for a little bit, but it died out when it no longer saw that threat. So the New England Confederation was the first attempt at the colonies to even try to come together under some coalition. The second step, the Albany Plan of Union. This was in 1754. Look at that. Over 100 years later, And this is where we're really going to start to see things pick up. In the 1750s, there was a new leader, King George III, who came to power. And a lot of these things, the French and Indian War, the Albany Plan of Union, all these events start to come together, and it's causing a more hostile environment in the colonies. So at this time, 7 colonies said, let's get together and discuss the problems that we're having with trade and also the possibility or danger of attacks from Native Americans. Benjamin Franklin, this is one of your key people, Ben Franklin said, this is so important, I think we need to meet yearly. And the Albany Plan of Union met for a little bit, and then they later voted and rejected the meeting, saying each colony can take care of themselves or Great Britain will protect them, that they did not need to meet regularly. So that was canceled. Now, the next time the colonies will come together is really one of the huge acts that we see. One thing that happened was in 1765, there was a group that came together. Anytime you see a Congress, that's a gathering of men or women. I'm using that in a general term. But the Stamp Act was a reaction to the Stamp Act that was passed by Great Britain. And when King George III came to power, he said, we have got to raise money to fund, we have troops over there helping to protect the colonies. It's draining the treasury. They had wars in Europe, and they said, how are we going to raise money? So the Stamp Act was a new law King George III created, and it required the use of tax stamps on any legal document, on business agreements, on newspapers. They were on playing cards. Anywhere you went, this new tax was required. And they said, this is entirely ridiculous. Nobody asked our opinion. The people in Great Britain did not need to pay for it. It was only in the colonies. The taxes were renounced, and the famous phrase, no taxation without representation, started as a result of that Stamp Act imposed. Several phrases that we say, virtual versus actual representation. The colonists were frustrated because they did not have a voice in Parliament, in the House of Commons. They wanted actual representation. And when they requested that, Parliament and the King responded with, well, you don't need a person. We are representing all of you. All of us have a say in what is happening in America. So you do not need a single person to represent you. And so they called that virtual representation, and the colonies were not very happy with that. So what they did was, this Congress was so angry, they wrote a Declaration of Rights and Grievances. And this was basically a list of complaints, and they sent it to King George III. And in sending that, they were airing their grievances. They were addressing the king. They were petitioning the king for change in behavior to renounce the tax. As a result of the Stamp Act, when they sent this, a direct result was the tax was repealed. But in retaliation of that, I guess you could say, the Townshend Acts were passed. And these were even harsher laws in place of the Stamp Act to help raise money. The colonists were very angry at this time, and they decided to resist the tax and to make it hard on England, and they reacted with boycotts. In the boycotts, that's a refusal to buy or sell or trade the products. They boycotted all English goods. Several events happened as a result of this. One of the largest was the Boston Massacre. And I'll talk about this in class just a little bit more, but the Boston Massacre really was a catalyst to galvanizing support, because it was the first time the King's men fired upon the colonists. They call this one of the great acts of propaganda, because the committees of correspondence led by Samuel Adams used that event and that famous painting painted and engraved by Paul Revere. They sent it up and down the coast, knowing that a lot of people couldn't read, but they knew that if they captured the picture of the British firing into a crowd of helpless citizens, that people would remember this. And this was one of the first events that really started to change the tide of public opinion against the British. Again, the committees of correspondence created by Sam Adams, or led by Sam Adams, and those groups responded and really helped lead a lot of the resistance movement against the crown. The next act was the Boston Tea Party. This was 3 years later, again in reaction to the taxes and the hardships. A group of colonists dressed up as Native Americans, they go onto the ship and they dumped tea into the harbor. It was a quiet act of resistance, but one that angered the king so. They called it making the biggest pot of tea in the history because it turned Boston Harbor brown. It didn't really happen, but that's what they, claimed to. And the Boston Tea Party was met, with harder resistance as well. They went ahead and shut down the port of Boston. They wanted to find out who had done this, and it really creates a horrible situation in the royal colony of Massachusetts. This was a picture I was talking about earlier that was spread up and down the coast by Paul Revere, and this is the picture captured by Paul Revere that it had the the redcoats firing into this crowd of helpless, innocent colonists, and it really turned the tide of public opinion. Again, one of the first signs of propaganda toward the creation of a new country. This is a picture depicting the Boston Tea Party. So what happens as a result of this? So the Boston Tea Party was 73. This group decides we need to meet as a continent with all the colonies represented. So one of the first meetings was called the First Continental Congress in 1774. 12 of the 13 colonies were present, and they decided again to send a letter to King George III. They issued the Second Declaration of Rights and Grievances. They agreed to bind together and boycott trade with Britain. And when they left that meeting, after they sent this declaration, they said, we have got to meet again in May of 1775. And so they ended that First Continental Congress. The Parliament was angry, declared the colonies in rebellion. And one of King George III's most famous lines, well, the die is now cast. And you might have read that from Shakespeare. The die is now cast. These New England governments are in a state of rebellion. Good. I am not sorry. The lines have been drawn. Now blows must decide whether they are to be our subjects or independent. Again, August 1775, quite angry with the treatment between the colonies and Great Britain. So out of this comes one person, Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine wrote the famous pamphlet, Common Sense, which was distributed up and down the coast. This was a very clear and compelling reading that supported thinking about what if we did leave Great Britain? Maybe the cause should be independence. Look at all that King George III has done. So this says, it's surprising, but nothing will clear up our situation so quickly, so efficiently as an open and determined declaration for independence. Until this happens, we are like that man who puts off some unpleasant business day after day. He knows it has to be done. He hates to start doing it. He wishes it were all over, and he's haunted by the fact that he knows he has no other choice. The blood of those already killed cries out for it. It is time to part. So Thomas Paine, writing his famous lines in the pamphlet Common Sense, that was in August 1775. One event that is leading up, and I'm going to stop here right now, is April 19th, 1775. This is the shot heard around the world, which is the Battle of Lexington and Concord. This event will happen right before the Second Continental Congress, and this will be the fifth and final part before we talk about the Declaration of Independence. So I just wanted to leave you with those 5 key points. Remember, as we went through these slides, you're talking about the 4 main ones. If you go back again, starting with the New England Confederation, going to the Albany Plan of Union, the Stamp Act Congress, the First Continental Congress, and then we will begin class tomorrow with the Second Continental Congress.